The emotional benefits are those things which actually tie people together, the kind of things that lead to reactions by people. And it is the emotional benefits of companionship, of belonging to a community, of obtaining pleasure, reassurance. All of these kind of factors are provided by media companies in their activities. And ultimately, self-expression. And in the past, self-expression meant primarily you picked a newspaper that represented your political viewpoints, you picked magazines that were related to your hobbies, you watched television shows that conveyed who and what you are. But what is increasingly happening now with the change in communications and the change in the ability of the public to participate is now they're wanting to express their own opinions and ideas and debate with others. And this is very disturbing, particularly for established media who are used to controlling or moderating the debate, because the debates that's taking place now, as we have people commenting on our programs, as we have people doing blogging, as we have people running their own websites, is very much akin to what has traditionally taken place in cafes and taverns around the world for all of social history. People debating ideas in a very different way, sometimes civilly, sometimes uncivilly. And it is a part of the process that they're wanting to engage in. But for organizations that have a culture that hasn't been built on this is a very dislocating and disturbing trend, and they have difficulty coping with it or understanding what it means to them. Now, when we look at news organizations particularly, and we see how they have created value in recent years, we see a number of things. The first thing was to increase the volume of content. And that is, we started in the first part of this century with newspapers that were much smaller. Newspapers today are about 3 times bigger than they were at the beginning of the 20th century. News on television usually started at about 15 minutes of news, then went to a half-hour of news, some places to 2 hours of news, and then 24-hour news. The amount of content that is flowing is just absolutely dramatic. In Europe, we're producing 1,000 books a day. I've created one of them here, and it's one of, the amount is staggering, and we've always assumed that the more information and content you give, the better it is in creating value. Speed of information, getting information very quickly, having it immediately rather than having to wait till the 8 o'clock news. Being able to get information from any part of the world in a very rapid way. All of these were seen as ways to develop value in news and in content around the world. Certainly there were other techniques, having exclusive information or having specialized information. If you look, for instance, at financial news always received about 20 to 25% more in exchange than general news, because it could be acted on. A variety of professional specialized content exists. We have specialized content in magazines for people who like food, for people who like sailing. We have more and more specialized content now in cable and other such things as we've proliferated those opportunities. And of course, on the internet, the degrees of specialization are almost infinite. We're seeing a lot of effort to try to create value through cross-media, repurposing of existing content, using it in different kinds of ways. Now, these are not, in fact, very useful in many cases. The volume of content's a problem, and part of it is we have always argued that the more information you have, the more choice you have, the more ability that people have to get news and information, make decisions. That's helpful in creating value because it differentiates the content and the provider along the way. It's useful because it increases demand and willingness to pay, which is wonderful for a company that's operating commercially or at least trying to pay its bills. The problem is it's almost impossible to maintain exclusivity in news and information. It tends to work a little better with entertainment and sports, but it's not perfect even with those. And essentially, the development of new forms of communications and new forms of media make it almost impossible to maintain exclusive distribution for very long. And this is a particular problem. It's also a problem because so much media are dependent upon syndicated content from news and feature services, from syndicators of television programming and radio programming today, that you don't have exclusivity anyhow. So that creates an issue. Specialization, of course, is an old tactic in business of all kinds, where you differentiate your product, makes it easier to reach the market. The problem is the more differentiated and specialized you become, the less valuable it is to more people. And so it raises the value to a few people, but makes it less valuable to the greater one. And so that, of course, creates a business trade-off on how much money you're going to be able to get from them. And ultimately, this is why we've had a good deal of consolidation in magazine industries and other such things, where you have portfolios being created in order to try to take care of the economic problems that are caused by specialization. Repurposing and cross-media activities have been the buzzword for about 20 years now, as we've moved heavily into the internet era. And the idea of taking media from created in one and putting them out on other platforms, certainly there's some functional benefits for firms that are doing that. So we typically reconfigure the content we have, or just repurpose it or use it in a different kind of way. The problem with this is that it commoditizes content, and anybody that's ever looked at commodities know the more commoditized the content, the less value it becomes. And because we are having it in many different platforms, because we're repeating its uses, because it's no longer exclusive to a particular platform, it loses value. And so this creates some very interesting challenges in terms of producing the value that we are trying to produce to keep our organizations alive. So what are we looking at as we look at the future? Well, very clearly we have to do some things to increase the value, or media companies are going to face their demise. This is certainly true for news media heavily, and also for entertainment, but particularly for news media. And that means that ultimately we have to go back to some very basics about understanding what is the value in journalism and news processing. Why is it valuable to have an editor who goes through 20,000 stories a day and picks the 200 that we think are most important for us? There is some value there that we have to emphasize more and more, because this is part of the value that is being created. Because as the volume of news and information rises in society, and we are unable to cope with it ourselves, having the services provided by editors and journalists in sorting that information is an important part. Certainly specialization or localization are ways to increase value. The emphasis of the coverage. The emphasis of the coverage now is merely to say something happened. It is no good to say in tomorrow's newspaper what people have already watched tonight or tomorrow morning in the news and television, or what they've received the information through their internet or through their social networking. It has to provide it in a different way. And because newspapers do not have the temporality that internet does and that television does, they cannot continue to provide the same information, and they're going to have to rely more on analysis and explanation of events rather than merely telling what happened at the event. Because more and more the public has watched the event live on television or cable. More and more the public has received the general news of what was going on on their mobile services or on their internet.